the Crimson Tower Lord, and the most feared Seventh Circle arch-mage on the continent, hovering in the air above the shattered arena, crackling with devastating magical energy. Two of the most capable mages of the Scarlet Flame Tower, Vanessa and Hubert, were battered and bleeding, clinging to consciousness in a room that felt less like a hall of ceremony and more like a tomb waiting to be sealed. The Archduke's plan was working. The tower was falling apart from the inside, and then a single figure stepped through the entrance, completely composed, and calmly introduced himself. Ghislain Perdium, Count of Fenris, the greatest swordsman of the North. Vanessa exhaled with visible relief. Hubert, bruised, barely upright, called out to him like a man who had just spotted solid ground after being swept out to sea. Delmud, still floating above them with his magic still surging, went cold. He recognized the name instantly. This was the one who had been unraveling the Archduke's schemes from the inside, dismantling plans that had taken years to build. His jaw tightened. He didn't hesitate. He ordered Ghislain to stand down, citing the formal rules of the exchange, that a noble had no authority to interfere in the sacred duels between mages. Ghislain didn't argue. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply turned to Hubert with a faint smirk and pointed out that it seemed the Tower Lord hadn't yet been informed of something. Hubert blinked. He had no idea what Ghislain was talking about. Then Ghislain announced it plainly. He was here not as a noble spectator, but as an official guest mage representing the Scarlet Flame Magic Tower, and he had simply arrived a little late to the venue. The silence that followed was stunning. Hubert's face cycled through shock, confusion, and outright disbelief in about 2 seconds. He began to object, sputtering that even if Ghislain was the greatest swordsman alive, calling himself a mage was pure absurdity. And then Vanessa's staff connected with his ribs in a sharp, unambiguous message. Hubert took the hint. In an instant he recovered his composure, puffed out his chest, and loudly proclaimed that every word was true. That the Baron of Fenris was indeed a guest mage he had personally invited. Delmud stared down at them with contempt. He was not convinced, but more importantly, there was a thin bead of sweat forming on his forehead. He did the math quickly. Vanessa and Hubert were already in no condition to fight further. His original strategy had been to crush the Scarlet Flame Tower first, then deal with the Count of Fenris separately. But now his targets had walked into the same room at the same time. He could feel fate handing him a shortcut, and he decided to take it. A dark grin spread across his face. If the Count of Fenris wanted to throw himself into the fire willingly, then Delmud would oblige. He'd eliminate every enemy of the Archduke right here in one devastating sweep. The energy sphere he conjured was the same one that had nearly levelled the palace moments before, immense, pulsing, almost alive with destructive force. Lightning began tearing through the clouds above the building. The whole structure groaned under the weight of what was gathering. Hubert and Vanessa watched in pale, frozen horror as Delmud's laughter echoed through the ruined hall. "Everything comes down to force," he declared. That was the only truth that ever mattered. Ghislain drew his sword. The blade ignited with crackling red lightning the moment it left the sheath. He didn't look afraid. He looked like someone who had been waiting for exactly this. His answer was simple. He agreed completely. Then he detonated off the ground. The speed was something that didn't look real. Delmud had the altitude, the preparation, and the power of a full Seventh Circle mage behind him, and he barely had time to react before Ghislain's blade was already at his head. Panicking, he poured everything he had into catching the sword between raw magical force, and he felt it beginning to cut through even that. He blinked away using his teleportation technique, abandoning an afterimage in midair, and reappeared a short distance back, breathing hard. The realization hit him like cold water. A man with a basic sword had just shredded a Seventh Circle magic barrier. 1 second slower, and it would have been over. Delmud refused to crumble. He summoned a ring of magical blades forged from pure condensed mana. A relentless volley launched straight at Ghislain, who was still suspended in midair. It should have been over. Instead, Ghislain extended one hand and deployed his mana threads, thin, glowing cords that hooked into the terrain below. and used them to spin, pivot, and weave through every single blade without touching one. The sight left Delmud staring. He hadn't believed what he was seeing. Mana threads were real, and a swordsman was using them with the kind of precision and instinct that mages spent decades to develop. He kept firing. Ghislain kept moving, and the distance between them kept shrinking. Once inside striking range, Ghislain drove a downward assault that Delmud could only barely block with a desperate defensive bubble conjured around his body. But blocking wasn't stopping, and Ghislain wasn't slowing down. The close quarters exchange that followed was brutal. Delmud struggling to parry, Ghislain controlling the tempo with every step. Then Ghislain turned the mana threads on Delmud himself. Mirroring a technique he had once experienced against him, Ghislain coiled the threads tight around the archmage's body, and then, with the full force of his physical strength, he hurled Delmud downward. The impact was catastrophic. Delmud hit the shattered stone floor and coughed up blood, tumbling across the wreckage. Hubert could barely form words. It was impossible. Delmud was a legend, a seventh circle master, and this man was overpowering him with his bare hands and a sword. From somewhere deep inside Ghislain's body, a voice whispered its admiration. The contracted spirit Dark, who resided within him, couldn't help but remark that his master truly knew how to handle someone of this rank, and added, almost with a shade of nostalgia, that even this wasn't close to what Ghislain had been capable of in his past life. Ghislain told him flatly to be quiet. Delmud forced himself upright. He was bloodied, gasping, and furious. He demanded to know what kind of power this was, because what Ghislain was using was nothing that any ordinary knight should possess. That murky energy wrapped around him, he said with sudden sharp realization, looked identical to the forbidden power the archduke had granted to his most trusted secret agents. The words landed harder than they were meant to. Ghislain's expression shifted. It was a fleeting thing, just a fraction of a second, but it was there. Delmud pressed upward into the air again, the storm gathering around him with renewed intensity. He admitted he didn't know how Ghislain had come to carry that energy, but he understood now why the Archduke's forces had struggled so desperately to bring him down. He laid everything bare with grim clarity. His own rise to the seventh circle had only been possible through the Archduke's grace and backing. Everything he was, he owed to that house, and so he would repay the debt here, even if it meant dying. The sphere of energy he drew together was enormous, filling the air above him, blotting out the light, pressing down on the entire structure. Bolts of lightning shredded through the walls. The Grand Academy began to collapse around them. Hubert screamed at the surviving mages to evacuate, using his own magic to lift the elders clear of the crumbling ceiling. Vanessa grabbed the injured Alpoi, barely conscious, barely breathing, and pulled him toward the exit. Ghislain did not move. He looked up at the descending force of a seventh circle master, burning his final reserves, and he leaned casually on his blade for just a moment. Then he called inward to Dark, his voice low and even, and commanded him to amplify his power. He dropped into his stance. Dark's aura began rising from him like smoke from a fire that had just found oxygen. But Ghislain wasn't done. He pushed through the pressure and demanded more, driving past the limits of what his body should safely carry. Dark's voice screamed back at him that he was already drawing mana at a reckless, almost suicidal rate, and questioned whether he truly intended to push further. Ghislain didn't answer. He commanded his fourth core to open. 4 radiant golden cores erupted around his body, and the one at the center of his chest blazed the brightest, a concentrated pillar of raw, untamed power that swallowed the darkness around it. Dark's voice went from protest to something closer to deranged laughter. He stopped arguing. He warned Ghislain, coldly, one final time, that if this killed them both, the body would belong to the spirit. Then he plunged directly into the glowing core and merged. Ghislain let the rage fill him. The enemies he had lived with since his past life, Duke Delphine, Idun, every name that had cost him everything. He pulled those memories forward like fuel, let them burn, and channeled that burning into the sword in his hands. Above him, Delmud brought it all down. The colossal energy sphere dropped like a falling star, its purple light consuming everything in its path, aimed squarely at ending Ghislain's existence. Ghislain swung. The aura blade technique released everything at once. A towering pillar of golden light erupted from his sword and drove upward with unstoppable force, meeting Delmud's inferno head-on and splitting it directly down the centre. The golden strike didn't slow. It tore through the sphere, scattered the remnants, continued rising, and found Delmud at the top. The Crimson Tower Lord had no expression left for fear. His face froze, and then the golden blade passed through him. Delmud was bisected cleanly. The reign of the Archduke's most loyal seventh circle weapon ended not with a battle of equals, but with a man from his past who remembered killing him once before, and did it again. Far from the ruins of the Grand Academy, the world continued quietly. A house sat nestled among forested hills, unremarkable except for the group gathered in the open courtyard, disciples in mid-training, moving through their drills under the patient eye of their master. He watched them with the kind of focus that only comes from someone who has spent an entire lifetime understanding exactly what separates survival from death at the edge of a blade. A hooded figure approached without announcement and leaned in to whisper something. The master stilled. He clapped once, drawing everyone's attention, and announced that the lesson was ending for today. His students wouldn't see him for a while. He had matters that could not wait. They pressed him. Would he return soon? He promised that he would, but the words he kept to himself said something else entirely. A disciple, however difficult or disappointing, was still a disciple. Whatever failures they carried as a student, the bond of a master was not something that ended with death, and the news he had just received made one thing very clear. Someone was responsible, and he intended to find them. The greatest swordsman of the North had just dismantled the Archduke's most powerful mage. His enemies were recalibrating, his allies were recovering, and somewhere beyond the hills, the man now walking away from his students with cold resolve in his eyes was preparing to bring something far more dangerous than a seventh circle mage directly to Ghislain's door. The sword of the East is coming, and he doesn't send armies.